Senator Seaman, I want to pursue the transportation bill that you discussed, and just from my perspective in this chair, not making any value judgments about what should be done or could have been done, but just over the weeks of this program, it was pretty clear that there was this huge divide between the Democrats on one side that were interested and supportive of a gas tax and Republicans who were not. And that seemed to be fueling the inability to get to the bottom line of some kind of transportation bill. Was there some other way of getting there without resolving that question some way?
I think that there was a willingness on the part of the Senate Democrats to compromise. The Senate Democrats, the line in the sand that we drew early on was that we didn't want a significant share of funding for transportation to come out of the general fund. And that sounds kind of wonkish, but really what it means is that if you just pay for transportation needs out of existing revenue, then it's going to squeeze that area of the budget that needs that revenue, whether it's healthcare or schools or anything else that the general fund does. So, but you did see in the final weeks of the session, there was a willingness of the Senate Democrats to compromise on that and to say, okay, we understand that the House Republicans are insisting that some money comes out of the general fund. And there was, again, a willingness to compromise. Now, as far as the gas tax goes, again, that is a major way that we fund roads and bridges in Minnesota. And if everyone can agree that the need is $600 million a year, an easy way to help get to there is to raise the gas tax.
But that's my point, is that there was this divide and there was no agreement on that point. And it didn't look like there was going to be an agreement to raise the gas tax.
That's correct. So then what did some of the House Republicans came forward with a proposal at the end that I don't think was supported by their caucus, by the rest of the GOP caucus, but did talk about raising substantial tab fees. So, you know, if you don't raise the gas tax as much, then you're going to raise some tab fees to try to get towards that $600 million mark. I think it's too bad. I mean, I wish there had been more willingness to compromise because the need is there, and we're not going to get there by shoving a bunch of transportation projects into the bonding bill, which generally happens every other year. So this is a real failure on the part of this legislature, and hopefully we can correct it here in a special session, but if not, then it will have to wait till next year.
Senator Pratt, any thoughts on this?
Well,
transportation in particular?
To me, and from what I saw, one of the major sticking points was an increased sales tax on the metro area that would be going to Met Council to fund the Southwest Light Rail, and so we would be asking the entire metro area to fund a project that was very specific to a small portion of the region. With that, excuse me, the governor didn't, and the Senate Democrats didn't even put it in their bonding proposal like they had the green line and the blue line. So to me, it seemed like there wasn't a real desire to be out there wanting to fund this directly, that they wanted to push that off to either the Met Council or some other entity. And as I've followed up in the last couple of days, CTIB can still contribute more money to the project if they decide that that is the number one project and it has to move forward. So there's nothing holding up the funding of the Southwest Light Rail. There are mechanisms in place if those that want it are willing to fund it.
I think that it's important to understand, though, that if we want a comprehensive transportation system that includes transit in the metropolitan area, there needs to be new revenue. I mean, give me that, Senator Pratt. There needs to be new revenue to build out a whole system. The Southwest Rail Line, if the state can come up with its portion of the match, will leverage almost $900 million. It will be in excess of $1 billion construction project in the West Metro. That will benefit the entire state's economy to have that much federal money coming in. It doesn't directly benefit my constituents who are on the exact opposite side of the Twin Cities, but my constituents, I think, understand that to build out a transit system, we need new revenue, and that's why the Democrats pushed for Metro sales tax increase in their transportation funding package, and that's why it wasn't in the bonding bill, because at that point when we passed or tried to pass the bonding bill, we were still hoping that there would be a transportation package that included increased funding for the metro area.
But I think where you and I see it differently is that I see it, if there's a will, there's a way. And there is a way. If CTIB or the Met Council or Hennepin County wants to step up and cover, because there is no mandated state obligation. It's just that we have to come up with the local match. At $122 million per mile versus about $10 million per mile for a road, we could do significantly more with that same amount of money. Now, I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be transit and that we don't need to move people around, but we're not talking about buses, or we're not talking about operations. We're talking about building a very expensive corridor that's highly controversial through the communities it's going through. Because I'm getting emails from people in Minneapolis asking me, please intervene and stop it from going through Kenilworth. So I would say where we don't agree is that if there's a will, there's a way. And if CTIB, the county's Transit Investment Board, or Hennepin County feel this is a project that needs to move forward, they can move it forward.
Well, Hennepin County can't move it forward on its own, because that was the amendment that we were trying to add at the very last minute of the legislative session. I'd also point out that even if CTIB could pay for that, the local share, that means we're not building out the rest of the system. Into my district, into Afton, there's the Gateway Corridor, the Gold Line. That's bus rapid transit. And then down along the Mississippi River, there's the Red Rock Corridor. Again, that's bus rapid transit. So the increase in the metropolitan sales tax is not all going to go towards funding Southwest. It will go to build out operational use of buses and transit lines all across the metropolitan area. And certainly, I think if we want to have a transportation system that really serves the needs of business and people and gets people around the Twin Cities, we need to make that investment.
Representative Albright, we don't want to leave you out of this conversation on transportation. What do you think?
You know, I think to the senator's point, we did fund transportation projects to the tune of $700 million. For the next year. We would have had MnDOT awash with funding for a myriad of projects. But I think the bigger question that is on a lot of people's minds, and one of the things that I took up this session was, we've got an unelected body in the Met Council who has a budget that is larger than 16 of their smaller MPOs around the country. Unelected, you can talk all day about whether or not they should be elected or not, but the point being is that there is a communication or a trust factor with regard to the guidance and over the counties that they serve. And that's why you have CTIB originate. That's why you have a number of counties go to Washington and lobby for a full observation that the MPO or the Metropolitan Planning Organization needs to fulfill their obligations rather than the tab. And so those reform measures in there, I think, that we put into our transportation budget actually would have gone a long ways towards restoring the faith in that. Because when you talk about Met Council, all you hear is they want to build trains. To your point, they don't even deliver the people that are in need of jobs to, it doesn't even go through their neighborhoods. We're standing out on University Avenue, and we see the trains go by every day. The fare box recovery is 26%. That's not meaningful rehabilitation in terms of usage of that train, to the extent that they're vacant. They're going back and forth and vacant. The highest usage of that train is on a Saturday when the University of Minnesota, or on Sunday when the Minnesota Vikings use that, and they're parking some distance away and using it to get to the bank. So I think
bank
there's
being the stadium.
The stadium, getting to the bank, yeah. And so to the extent that the Met Council has or does not have the wherewithal to fund it, I would dare say that I think first and foremost there needs to be recognition of whether or not light rail is really a useful tool for a transportation mode in this state, when, if you take a look at the data, it's just not there, because people are freedom lovers and they love their cars. They do enjoy their buses because buses are movable. You don't put hard rail down on the ground, and you can serve, and if changes or adjustments need to be made, you can make those accordingly, as opposed to a fixed rail system that I don't think anyone really believes serves the best interests of the metropolitan area.
Well,
You want to weigh in on this?
a couple of things I'd like to point out, and some of what I would say Senator Sieben touched on in terms of when you look at the funding and what the needs are. There really are two pieces. There's the whole issue of whether or not you build light rail, but that's only part of the question. There's the other half is the operations and the building out of the bus system. So I think you have to keep in mind that there are those two parts. When we talk about transportation and how much may or may not have been on the table at a given point in time, the bill that hit the House floor during the final hours had $300 million from the general fund. Now, I was very concerned about taking money from the general fund, but the one thing I asked in Ways and Means of Representative Knobloch, the chair, I said, is that one-time money or will that be permanent? He said, I don't know. But by the time the bill hit the House floor, it was determined that that would be one-time funding. So we really were talking about a short-term solution when we needed a long-term. And from my perspective, the good news is that that would have been one-time funding versus permanent funding when you talk about the general fund. And the way I put it, the general fund, if we started funding transportation through the general fund, is picking up a brand new partner, a major partner, because we have a long-standing tradition in Minnesota and most other states, quite frankly, of using dedicated funding, a separate revenue stream for transportation. So that would have been a huge change. Now, when we talk about funding part of it with bonding, historically, and Senator Sieben has been on the committee for a number of years, capital investment. I was on it for many years. I don't happen to be currently this session, but it was roughly about $50 million out of what would be, let's say, a $900 to $1 billion bonding bill through the years that went for transportation. So there was always a small amount, but when you start moving that number up to 250, 300 million, that's a huge change in terms of how you handle the capital investment and the bonding as well. So you really had two things in play there, general fund and bonding, and major changes that would have changed the fiscal direction of the state for many years to come. And in my view, in not a good way.